It's about the subject of determinism and how the adoption of a belief in determinism, or how the adoption of such a philosophy is problematic. And I will post a link to the video of it, and I will also post a link to the transcript of it. And I would highly recommend actually reading the transcript. I think that there's a density of language that is perhaps better absorbed by reading it. There is kind of a level of criticism that I want to employ, but it's not even so much a criticism, because I do agree more or less with what I think he's getting at. But I think that there's an incompleteness at work conceptually here. And I've been thinking about this for the past few days, and it's trying to organize my thoughts about this has been extremely difficult for some reason. So please bear with me if this video seems a little like I'm groping towards something, because that is what's happening right now. But when I remember when I first read the essay, my first recognition was, or my first feeling about it was that there are sort of echoes or reverberations of Max Weber. Max Weber being sort of the father of sociology. And my thinking on this has been largely trying to figure out why that's the case, and figure out why I felt that there was a degree of incompleteness, because I felt that these two were interlinked with one another. But what I've sort of landed at in the past hour or so is that I don't think... I think that Theo Warner's conception of his own criticism... I think that determinism is perhaps too narrow of a space in which to conduct this criticism. I think that this criticism is perhaps much more wide-reaching. In other words, the siren song of determinism would perhaps be one voice in a larger counterpoint, right? And I think the larger picture... Well, the other thing about determinism is that there's something very passive about determinism. There's something very reified about it, and inert about determinism. Like, I can't imagine a praxis of determinism, or a practice of determinism for that matter. I can't imagine what that's like as an active, motivating force. And I think that the essay kind of presupposes that. So a lot of my struggling has been trying to deal with what that means. But I think that it began to make sense when I realized that when I did situate it into a specific concept by Max Weber, and I think a very important concept, probably his most important, or at least for me, his most important concept. And that's the notion of rationalization. When I talk about rationalization here, I'm specifically referring to this strand of thought. I'm not talking about it in, like, Freud uses that term as well in a radically different way, and that's, or, you know, psychoanalysis has a conception of what that word means, and that's not what I'm going for. Max Weber uses the term rationalization to describe a certain kind of reason that looks at the world as a series of cost-benefit analyses and ends-means relationships. And in some way this is far too reductionist, but one example that I've used before to describe this is if I say, you know, if privileging, one aspect of rationalization is this notion of efficiency. And if I were to say, you know, I'm going to drive from my house to work, well then the rationalized mind would, or the instrumental reason, you know, the rationalized way of looking at this problem of how to get to work would simply say take the fastest, shortest way. You know, you'll spend less on gas, you'll get there faster, etc., etc., etc. And it might exclude all of these other ways that I might choose to go on the basis of something like maybe a more roundabout way would be more scenic, or I might have some kind of emotional attachment to it. Maybe I'd drive by a cemetery or something where someone that I loved was buried, and those kinds of reasons would compel me to take a longer route. That's sort of maybe a bit too reductionist way of looking at what rationalization is. But I think that this way of looking at the world it has a horrible side effect, in that if you do adopt such an attitude towards all the myriad problems of life, you end up in a really rigid, controlled structure, a really rigid way to deal with the world, to the point where this would be the annihilation of subjectivity in a certain way. The human being would ultimately be radically reduced to a cog in a machine. It's also important to note, just as a side note, that the rationalization of society for Weber is goes part and partial with the disenchantment of the world and the secularization of the world. That's a side note, but I think it's important in the context of Theo Warner's essay. From this perspective, we can see that the concept of rationalization is an active thing in people's lives. It motivates people, or it guides people's motivation. It guides people's actions. It's something that is an organic part of people's lives, rather than I think determinism, which is, again, I described it as inert. But I think that a deterministic view of the world is also a rationalized view of the world. So in some way I would say that this focus on determinism is too narrow, and I think the broader topic would be, again, this specific concept of rationalization, of which determinism would be an exponent, as well as a certain approach to naturalism. Perhaps another way to think of rationalization would be, you could imagine a rationalized ethics. This would be, you know, Sam Harris would be the pinnacle of this. Saying, like, looking at ethical problems as being a cost-benefit analysis, looking at them as being ends-means relationships, to the radical point where he seems fairly comfortable justifying actions like torture and military intervention and all of these things that I would consider to be ethically problematic. He justifies them as an ethical stance, and I think what allows him to do this is an extremely rationalized view of what ethics is, and therefore also, I think, what the human subject is. And maybe we could say, and I don't want to actually get into it really, but I think that you could point to the Thunderfoot article that he posted on Free Thought blogs about sexual harassment at conferences, and how, you know, it's not something that's sort of quantitatively prevalent, and therefore it's something that we shouldn't really, we shouldn't spend a lot of time talking about it, or we should, because it's sort of beside the point. And like the way he articulates all of this is very, like, again, I would use the term rationalized. It's very cost-benefit analysis, means-end relationships, when I think in some way ethics is about the exact opposite of that. And I think maybe we could also look at aesthetics in this way, as, you know, this becomes a substantial, you know, from Weber, Adorno, who I posted a video up a few weeks ago. Adorno does something like this, but you could imagine a bunch of record label executives weighing out what products to promote and what products not to promote, what musicians to back, etc., etc., etc. And those conversations aren't happening on the basis of the quality of the art. whatever that might mean, without getting into the issues of aesthetics. The but the point is that the record label executives aren't having the conversation from the perspective of the aesthetics either. They're having that conversation on speculations of what will and will not sell in a certain marketplace, conforming to certain trends and certain demographic data and blah, blah, blah. You can see how the whole thing becomes very quantitative. The whole conversation becomes very mathematical, very, in a certain way, very cold in its reasoning, dispassionate, bureaucratic. That's another really important aspect of rationalization, the notion of the bureaucratizing of societies. So yeah, this would be perhaps the slight, I'm not sure if it's a criticism, it's a slight displacement, I think, or a slight opening up of the conversation, of the criticisms that Theo Warner presents, which I just think are a bit localized, and again, I said narrow before, but I think to the point where it the pre-understood notion of determinism, because it doesn't define some other conception of determinism, so we have to assume that it's the pre-understood notion of determinism. And I think that he sort of bumps up against what that can do, or what that can describe. And I think, and I don't think it's I don't want to say it's a willful act of equivocation or anything, but I think that the critique is perhaps too big for the foundation upon which it's placed. And I think you could probably almost go through the entire essay, take out the word determination, insert the term, or determinism, insert the term rationalization, and I think you would end up with something that's much that there's a whole lot to think about all of a sudden. The discursive possibilities would be almost endless, and it would also, I feel like talking about isms lands you in this philosophical space where you're talking about concepts. So talking about determinism feels alienated from real subjective experience, I think. Rationalization as a concept doesn't. So I don't know if that's really a criticism, but I hope it's something to think about. And I ask you, Mr. Warner, if you're watching, to please respond in some way, because I'm nervous that what I'm saying isn't going to capture you in the way that I would hope it would. So yeah, comment, subscribe, etc. Links in the description and all that. Have a good day.